Okay, so that's our first section done in terms of tips and advice. So we're now on to creative writing. So depending on where you're at in terms of your particular school with your assessment pieces, you may have started this, you may have already finished it, or it may be coming up in this next term. So we're going to have a look at this now. Creative writing's purpose. So it's traditionally to entertain, but it can also be used to create and communicate deeper messages to wider audiences. So not everyone likes reading the news and tertiary level things. So creative writing can be a really effective way of getting things across in a format that can be more digestible for people. So it can take lots of different forms. There's no particular blueprint or structure for this type of writing, which is a little bit different to our essays and our persuasive speeches. But it does revolve a lot around the genre. So you could have creative writing that's actually poetry, where you have stanzas and lots of different types of poetry, or you could have post-apocalyptic short story, or sci-fi, or romance, or all of those different genres that you have. They will determine the way that you approach your short story writing or your other creative writing piece. So where you'll find it, as I mentioned before, you'll either already have done this or be doing it now, or it will be coming up, all depending on your particular school. And there's a couple of ways that your school may approach this. You could be asked to fill a gap in an existing novel. So you would read that novel or that story of some sort, and you would have to pick out a spot that you can explore that the story itself hasn't already explored. Or you may be writing from another character's perspective, or you may just be writing a short story from scratch yourself. Okay, so coming up with ideas. When you have to either come up with your own idea from scratch for a story, or you have to fill in a gap and you need to come up with a sort of angle for that. Keep in mind that there's really nothing totally new out there. So you'll be taking inspiration from other stories, other media around you, things that you know, things that you like. And in fact, doing that is encouraged. It's going to bring a richness to what you're doing. But you need to find a way to make it your own as well. So you're not just copying existing things that are out there, and it's not your own thinking at all. You want to find new ways of telling stories. And to do that, you can really let your real life experiences inspire you as well. So our tutor who created this particular slide has said here that one of their favorite stories is about a fight that the author had when she was 13 with her best friend. So things like that are just really simple, really everyday, that can inspire your stories as well. And kickstart your work with a single element. So you just need one little thing sometimes to get you really started. So the different elements that we have here, the plot, the characters, the setting, you can just pick one of those. You may have this really strong vision of a particular place where you want your story to be set, and then based on that place, that setting, all of your characters and your ideas can come together to form around that one original idea. With this setting, this makes sense. With this type of character, this would make sense in terms of the other elements. So have a look at that list and think about one that you might find easiest to start with, and then go from there. Okay, narrative structure and plot. So there's a couple of different ways that we can approach short stories, and they will really impact the way that you write, and also clarity as well. So often with short stories, we do go with more of a simple structure because it can be confusing doing something too complicated, because we don't really have time to make it clear, to flesh it out enough that the reader would understand it. So when you have a linear or chronological structure, everything is in the order that the events have occurred. So you get out of bed, you have breakfast, you get on the bus, you arrive at school, the bell rings, etc. Non-linear or fractured, time is going to be a little bit more disjointed. You can have flashbacks when you go back in time, or flash forwards when you go forward in time. And they can sort of foreshadow things to come or link together different ideas. So an example of how that can be used is when I was at school and I wrote a short story, I had to do a post-apocalyptic story. So I never was really into the aliens or zombies idea. So the thing that I decided to go with was the Amazon rainforest was taking over the world, and I made it about sort of the nature, I guess, getting revenge on humans for the way that we mistreat the environment now. So the flashbacks that I had a young sort of school age character, and she woke up all of a sudden in this new world where it was nature everywhere, and she was in the middle of the forest without other people. And I have two flashbacks in that story where you go back in time to her in her school classroom when she was learning about deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, and learning about those sorts of things, that that mistreatment of the environment. So it sort of linked together that message I was going for. I was going for that message about how we've mistreated the environment, and that has resulted in potentially the environment fighting back at us. So that's an example of how you can flash back in a story to create meaning and communicate the sort of messages. That those flashbacks made it clear that my overarching idea was that revenge kind of approach, with nature taking over because of mistreatment. So that's how you can use that. But you just have to be careful when you're doing it, because, like I said, it needs to still be clear. Circular is when you have the story ending where it began. It comes full circle. Parallel, multiple storylines occurring at the same time. Now, that is something that would be really tricky to actually do in practice. Usually, you have about 1,000 words for short stories at school. So, be cautious if you're going to attempt that. And framing a story within a story is another one. So, those are different considerations. I think the first two, linear versus nonlinear, is the main thing that you need to consider when you're writing a story, and whether it's feasible for you to do nonlinear or whether it's best to just make it linear for simplicity's sake. Okay, so our classic narrative structure, which I'm sure you've seen before in lots of different formats. So you have various words that describe the various sections, but here we've got exposition. That is just introducing the basics. That's just getting started. Conflict, rising tension, climax, falling tension, resolution. Most of those are pretty self-explanatory, but they're all very important. So a few other things to consider. Something that you may or may not have heard of is this idea of just starting in the middle. In media res is, I think, the Latin way of saying that. So the example I gave before about waking up, having breakfast, going to school, you wouldn't want that in a short story, when it's best to start from the middle. When we say start from the middle, we mean get to the good bit. So don't just start with all of the boring basics. If, the character's getting out of bed in the morning, then that's great, but we don't really need to know that. We want to jump straight to the bank robbery or the big accident or whatever it is that's actually engaging and exciting and will make people want to continue reading. So, thinking about where you'll actually start the story to make sure it's interesting enough, and not only to make it engaging, but also to make sure you have room to do the whole thing. So if you're starting with something that's not really relevant so much, that's not a good idea, because you don't have time to do anything in a short story that's not absolutely needed. Because, as I said, word count requirements, it's just not possible. So make sure everything that you've got in your short story is really necessary, is really valuable for your overall goal with the story, and just cut out anything that isn't. And if you're creating a short story from scratch, or even if you're filling in a gap from scratch, you need to have a climax in mind. I think planning is something that lots of us underestimate the importance of, but having that idea of where you're actually going is important, because oftentimes we have this general idea of what we're going for, but we realize later on that none of it's really a climax. None of it's really exciting enough to be considered a climax. So think about these different parts before you get started. Do some planning, and that will make sure that everything that you write is important. It'll make sure that your climax is actually climactic, and it'll help you with meeting those word count requirements as well. Okay, speaking about short story writing in terms of conciseness and meeting the word count. So, like I said before, the problem is introduced right at the beginning. Don't start with waking up or going somewhere in a really sort of everyday kind of way. Use something at the beginning that's actually engaging, actually interesting, and is going to be directly relevant to the climax and to the tension that you'll build in the lead up to the climax. Characterization is built through the character's response to the problem. So the way that they deal with the problem is really going to help you show what they're like. You don't need to focus so much on really explicitly saying everything about them. It's not good quality writing in general to say she's got brown hair and blue eyes and is this age and likes this and doesn't like this, all of those sorts of things. Those things you can introduce more subtly through, as we say, the way they respond to things, the way they speak, general little actions and little decisions, rather than just spelling it out really explicitly. Then the problem is you've got to have some kind of problem, and that can't be fixed, or there's some kind of complication with that, and that brings the tension. And then the ending, usually you're going to have a resolution. Sometimes you may have a cliffhanger where there isn't really a resolution, or something like that, but that is something that you need to consider the actual task that you've been given and find out from your teacher what the requirements are in terms of the resolution. A little bit of a tip here as well. When you write in a Word or a Google Doc, double space your lines, and that will trick your brain into thinking that what you're writing is actually a lot more lengthy, and that will mean that each word carries a lot more weight and you'll write a tighter piece as a result. If you see that what you've written goes over a couple of pages already, you'll automatically want to try and write concisely. Okay, good characters. Characters are a huge part of short stories. You can't have a short story without them. So the best characters are just believable. So they don't just, human beings aren't one thing. They're not sort of just black and white, don't like this, like this. They have a whole spectrum of emotions. They're complicated, those sorts of things. So you, in general, they're going to gain complexity as your story progresses, and their character is going to come through in the way they act and the way that they speak. And like I said before, they're not bogged down with physical description. So just talking about the way they look is not telling us a whole bunch about the way they really are. Don't judge a book by its cover and all those sorts of things. We want to know more about what they're really like rather than how they look. And those sorts of things are the things that you can plan for as well before you start writing. I know back when I was really, really little and I used to plan my stories, every time I would say the main character was a girl with brown hair and blue eyes and whatever, just because that was me. And I was familiar with me, so I just sort of reproduced me. First of all, there is some value in that, in, as I said earlier, using your own experiences and everything, but don't always just base everything on you, because that's going to be quite limiting. If your story is about a bank robbery or a huge disaster, I hope that you haven't experienced that yourself. So try and be broader than just you, but do use your own experiences to inform what you write about. and think beyond in your planning and in your story itself. Think beyond just those physical things, to how they feel, how they act, all those beliefs that people have, and how you can incorporate those. Okay, so some important questions to consider. What do you want? What does my main character want the most in the world? Because that determines their personality. It could be a Vegemite sandwich, or it could be world peace. There's a huge spectrum of different things that it could be. And so obviously whatever it is going to really show their personality, their motivations, um, their aspirations, all of those sorts of things. Why do they want that? That's going to determine their history. Because if we want things for a reason because of our personal experiences. So maybe they loved Vegemite growing up. Maybe they saw an Instagram post once. Maybe they've had some terrible or some amazing experience in the past that has led them to want to take a certain path. Thinking about what it is and why. And then, of course, how they actually plan on getting it. Because not only do you have to consider how they plan on getting it, but also you have to think about how you're going to prevent them from getting it, at least to begin with. Because when we think of a climax, when we think of complications and tensions, you shouldn't just make it really easy where it's all just a fairy tale, nothing goes wrong. They want this particular thing and they just get it without having to fight for it. So, so thinking about how to make that more complex to bring that tension, and as a result, that engagement from the reader. So it could be putting your crazy younger sibling in the way, or it could be the entire world is against you. Again, that huge spectrum of what you can go for. Either end of that sort of scale works. You just have to choose something that's right for your story. So a bit of an example from Hamlet, with those three questions answered. So what does he want? He wants revenge for his father's death and to bring order to his kingdom. His history, why does he want it? His love for his father and his sense of duty and his religion as well. And then the conflict. So how does Shakespeare, the author, prevent him from getting it? The most crippling case of procrastination. So we all know about procrastination, and that was the case in Hamlet as well. So that you can see how it all sort of comes together in practice with that Hamlet example. Now, thinking more about character profiles. So the origins, likes and dislikes, all those different elements. So physical and cultural background can determine what a person is like and how they were shaped. So those origins are a really important consideration in your planning. Likes and dislikes, just basic things that you can bring in to build their character, and to make sure that everything makes sense together. You need to have a really clear idea of what they like and don't like. It's what they crave and what they value, and what sort of motivates them to do certain things as well. You do need some physical traits. I know that I've said that shouldn't be your priority, but you do want to be able to allow the reader to picture your characters, to have that sort of closer connection with the characters by being given that description that allows them to feel like they actually may know the person and can picture them in their own mind. And there's a whole scale of from basic to specific that you can do for that. It can be hair and eye color, and it can be specific little features that they may have with maybe a birthmark that has a real big significance, or scars, or those sorts of things that tell us some kind of story about their past. Situation: what unique or different circumstances does your story present, and how does your character respond to them? Again, that's showing us their personality, how they approach things, what they believe in, and what they're willing to do to make things happen. Something that I also find students can find tricky is naming characters. So I wanted to highlight that here. If you're struggling to name characters, then I suggest using these sorts of aspects that we've spoken about to come up with something based on that. So if your story is about some kind of robbery involving a knife, then maybe a character's last name could be Sharp. Or if you want to be ironic, maybe it could be Blunt as their last name. So just thinking about different things that you've got in your story and choosing a name that's sort of a play on that can be kind of a creative, clever way of reinforcing maybe the messages that you've got, or just coming up with something that sort of makes sense and is a little bit more memorable as well. So that is my suggestion there. And then the other consideration is just thinking about the culture as well. We've spoken about setting and culture and what makes sense for where your story is at. If you're looking at writing a story that's based a long time ago, you need to think about what logically would I call my character with that in mind. There's lots of modern names out there now that would not be used back then, and you need to consider that. And then you can apply that to a futuristic kind of story or a contemporary story as well. Okay, how to adapt from a base text. So before you head off on any great adventures with doing an adaptation, you need to determine what you are bringing with you from the base text. So you do need to make sure that you align your story with the original text. That can be a real downfall of some students who either don't read the base text or read it but don't really spend time fully understanding it. We can have inconsistencies between the story that you write and the original one, which is not good. Or it could just not be so inconsistent, but maybe just the style is a little bit off. So maybe the short story or the story that you're basing your piece on, maybe the character who's speaking is really young. They're the narrator from first person perspective. And they speak in sort of a slang kind of casual way, and then you come in and write your adaptation or filling the gap, and suddenly you're really formal, and you sound older, more sophisticated, even though you're still writing from their point of view. Those things are the things that you need to consider when you're using that base text for an adaptation or for filling the gap. So things that you're bringing with you, also, you may be adapting it in a totally different way as well. You may be actually bringing it from one setting to a new setting, or maybe it is one character originally and you're changing characters, so it's from a different perspective. There's lots of different ways that you could adapt from a base text. So if you're filling the gap, then I guess your focus is on that consistency. And when you're adapting, you're thinking about what elements am I bringing with me? Are there specific messages? Is it going to be this idea of luggage, characters, having certain problems or certain backgrounds? Is it going to be a key theme or a key sort of idea? Is it maybe like the environment in the original one, or race, or ethnicity, or sexuality, or all of those sorts of themes that you could have, bringing them across from the base text into the new one. And we've got a bunch of examples there. And then other things are just characters, setting, etc. All of those general things that you can bring over from an original text. Even stylistic devices, maybe certain repetition of certain words, certain metaphors that are used often, those sorts of things. So considering what you'll bring with you to start with, so you can integrate it in a really logical way that is consistent and makes sense. Okay, so a few examples. So time travel. You need to consider how the culture of that time would affect the way audiences read your key concept. So I've spoken a lot already about culture and setting. And so if you are changing the time period, you really need to think about, and probably research as well, what it was like in that other time that you're writing about. And yeah, the way that all these different things, gender, class, etc., how they are viewed is very different in different periods. So use that to your advantage and use it in a way that's meaningful. Consider how you would look at race, which I've already mentioned in To Kill a Mockingbird, which, so in To Kill a Mockingbird, they have lots of sort of racist, what we would consider racist beliefs about people of color back in Southern America in the 1930s. And so if we look at that now through things like our Black Lives Matter movement, all of the movements out there like that, anti-discrimination things, we know that we've got a far different perspective on that today. So you need to keep those things in mind when you're time traveling in terms of adaptions. Teleporting, so it's a similar effect when you explore what a key concept would look like in a different geographical location. So colonial Australia looked very different to England during the same time period, and offered a lot of different opportunities. So not only the time, but also the place. And then, of course, perspective. So what perspective we're hearing the story from. So first person, second person, third person. Usually first person and third person are the common ones in short story writing. And you could switch the story from first person to third, or maybe just a whole new character gets the chance to tell the story instead of the protagonist. maybe instead of having the narrator, a third person narrator, you finally get inside the main character's mind and hear things from their perspective instead. So those are a bunch of different options in terms of adapting from a base text. Okay, so there is a strong chance that your creative piece will be a short story. You may have other things, like I said before, like poetry and stuff like that, but short stories are definitely the common ones you'll find. So some tips on those. When you write in short story form, you don't have a lot of room for characterization, like we've already spoken about. You want your stories to be tight in terms of being concise. So your character's voice should be really distinct from the very first moment that the audience meets them. And actions and speech are the best way of doing that rather than description of their appearance or their background. An example here of introducing sort of character relations and that characterization idea without being too lengthy. So a don't part is Sophie knew that Luke loved Vegemite all his life because he was such a messy eater and he always had a little bit in the corner of his mouth. She noticed this because she had known him all this time. So that's a really sort of lengthy way of saying basically they've known each other a while and she knows that he is a messy eater. So a new way of saying that's a lot shorter and just better to read as well is Sophie looked up to see the familiar smudge of Vegemite in the corner of Luke's mouth. At least some things don't change. So it conveys a little bit more sentimentality, like some things don't change. They're clearly like familiar with each other. They probably have a good relationship. And just the word familiar, it conveys a lot of information just in itself. There's no need to say she noticed this because she had known him all this time. So thinking of ways to say the same thing in a more condensed format. Your cast should be little. So cast as in your characters, your cast of characters. Too many names and too many background stories will confuse your audience and eat up your word count. So going with like 2 or 3 kind of characters can be handy to make it as easy to approach as possible. Making it more than that is just asking for a more difficult task, basically. And then in the same way, adding subplots will add unnecessary length and confusion. So keeping it simple, like I have said earlier, don't start with something that's actually irrelevant in your story. Start with things that are relevant, things that are engaging, and that's all going to help your message shine through. You're going to be able to meet your word count requirements and get across your messages clearly. And if you want to add all the sort of tension, the extra stakes, add it all at the beginning when you're building up the tension. Don't sort of add things at the end. Exposition in short stories is boring, so start it at an interesting moment, like I've said. So think about how you can leave impact. You should be able to use your emotions to connect your audience to the story, and be ruthless when you're editing. Get rid of anything that doesn't really contribute to what you're writing. avoiding cliches as well. And it was all a dream, or then it all went black. Think about something maybe that's more original. Those things can be useful sometimes, but oftentimes we can think of something that's a little bit more our own.